Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take the most important economic issues and deep dive into those topics. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson, and this month we have David Widmar and Brent Gloy back with us from Agricultural Economic Insights, along with their own Tom Hinkeldey, Financial Services Officer out of the Northwest Iowa region. Today's topic, discussing the value of calculating cost per bushel, seems unassuming, but it's interesting just how helpful but also misleading this calculation could be if used out of context. So thanks everybody for being here. Brent, let me kick this over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Carly. Great to be back with everybody again this month. I would say that when you think about management advice farmers are given, the number one issue or the number one piece of advice I always gives to know your cost. I've also heard a lot of people say, well, the other thing is you have to really, know your cost per bushel. And I agree with all of those statements. What we want to do today is help people understand how important it is to know your cost, and also why it's important to know your cost per bushel, but also know some of the limitations, because I've seen people get really wound up about how that's the only measure that matters. And I think as we'll see today, when you come to time to make decisions, because it's what we're really about, is we want to use this cost information we have to make better decisions in our farming operations. And we're going to give you some examples today of just how to go about doing that with understanding your cost per bushel. So what we want to do today is to start with a simple question, and it says, do you know your cost per bushel? Cost of production on a per bushel basis, or cost per pound if that's if you're selling pounds of crops or livestock. There's a lot of reasons. It seems like a pretty simple question, but there's a lot of reasons I think that people sometimes get hung up on this. And one of the reasons is that cost of production on a per bushel basis, for instance, can be difficult to know because we don't really know what our production is until after harvest. And so, I would guess a lot of people say, no, they don't know it, are sitting there going, well, how can I know what my cost of production is on a per bushel basis when I haven't harvested my crops? And this year, I really don't have a great idea of what those crops are going to make. If your production area is like mine, normally this time of year, I can get a pretty good estimate of my production. This year, I think that range is pretty wide. So I think as we go forward today, hopefully by the end of this, we'll all see some motivation to go ahead and really understand that cost per unit of output.
And Brent, I think this is the first straight up tie we've ever had on the poll. So 50% saying yes, they do know, 50% saying no, they do not know. So I didn't know where this would land out, but it's good to have this information. And I think as we work through and talk about this, the concept might be a little more familiar than it initially seems. And one of the challenges that oftentimes happen is, we're buying inputs on a per acre basis, seeds per acre or land per acre or fungicide programs or herbicide programs, but we're selling the bushels. And so there's this mismatch between the things that we're buying on an input basis and the things that we're selling, which are on an output basis. And let's talk about how this really plays out in an example. And one of the examples, it's a classic example. This is going to be something that's familiar to a lot of you, where you can see how it's familiar. And you can extrapolate it to your unique situation. Is, let's say you're a farm and you're raising corn and your production costs are $1,000 per acre, and your estimated yield is 180 bushels, and you're considering a fungicide application. And fungicide option number one gets you $25 per acre in expense. That's the cost. It's going to add 5 bushel per acre in estimated yield. Option number two is $50 per acre in expense and a 10 bushel increase in estimated yield. And so as you can see, there are things that are impacting the cost, and there are also these revenue components. There are these yield components. And, some of this could be driven by how valuable that corn is as you think through this. But one way that you can look at this is, what does it mean to be the low cost producer? And if you look at these alternatives, these three alternatives, and say, okay, what's my cost of production on a per bushel basis? The appeal to this method is it starts to help you think about that trade-off between higher expenses, but yet higher production. So for the base case, there's a $5.56 per bushel. For option number 1, it fell to $5.54 a bushel, and then the fungicide option number two, the third option, gets you down another penny to $5.53 a bushel. And so it really starts to frame up this idea. What's it mean to be a low-cost producer? Economists like to tell producers you have to be the low-cost producer, and that's not necessarily being the low-cost producer on a per acre basis or a per head basis. I always jokingly say, if you want to be the low cost, just don't plant anything, right? Don't have a seed bill, don't have a fertilizer bill. That isn't going to be the economic optimum. But this per output basis, per bushel or per head basis, per pound basis, allows us to think about those trade-offs between total expenses and productivity. So this is a fungicide example. We also see it with fertilizer. One of the cautions with high fertilizer prices that if we cut back, we could have an adverse yield impact, and that could really set us back as well. Also with feed, sort of feed option number 1 for our livestock versus option number 2. One of them might have a lower per pound cost or total cost of acquiring, but some of them might give us more benefits in terms of productivity. Also, we see something similar with equipment and how many acres we can cover in a day, or how fast we can get that done on an hour basis. But it's this trade-off that we have to keep in mind.
And David, I think one of the important things in an example like this is to realize one of the key drivers of this is that yield impact. And so, as I start to think about those things, a lot of times an option like a fungicide or something, I want to see a really high return because that yield impact can be very uncertain. So it's not usually linear like that. In other words, it doesn't just stair step up. Sometimes it can be either big, but if conditions don't cooperate, it may not be there at all. And so that's where we have to start really weighing the trade-offs in looking at numbers like this. Are, well, $50 per acre is known. The cost per unit of output is not really known because there's a lot of uncertainty about just what that estimated yield impact will be. And that's where we get into the really, the art of making the management decisions.
So think about the cost per bushel analysis, or cost per head, or cost per pound. There's some pros and some cons. On the pro side is what we just talked about. It accounts for that trade-off between changes in productivity and the changes in costs. And when we say you want to be the low-cost producer, you really want to be the low-cost producer on that output basis. We really want to get that down. The second thing that's a solid pro here is it's a familiar concept if we think about the break even. And a lot of times we take our total cost and our crop budget and we look at the number of acres or the number of bushels we're anticipating. And so that break-even concept is something that a lot of us are maybe familiar with. And so there is some familiarity there. On the con side, there are some cons to this analysis. First off, I'll just kick this up saying it's not going to solve all your management problems. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today is sometimes it's a tool that works really well, and sometimes it's a tool that doesn't work well at all. And it's oftentimes figuring out which one of those tools we need to use at the given time. The other specific con is that it's impacted by production variability. And so within agriculture, we know weather. And so as Brent talked about before, there's uncertainty as to how much of a response that fungicide will generate, but there's also probably uncertainty as to what the overall crop is going to look like. Another con is that it's not always intuitive. So example, if someone told you, oh, my profit was 10 cents per bushel, that doesn't tell you a whole lot about how much debt they can service or how much family living they can support. A lot of times we have to use some mental gymnastics to get this to a more tangible number, a more intuitive number, a more realistic number for what we're dealing with. Another con is that it can distort our thinking. Think back to that previous example. I told you it costs $50 per acre. A lot of us can really size that up really closely and know what that feels like. That's a pretty big expense. But if we could do the same math, and we could say, oh, it only costs 3 cents per bushel, and that doesn't really register in our minds quite the same way. And so Brent always says, if you want to make it look like a small cost, just divide it by a bigger number. So as you keep dividing by 180 bushels versus 1 acre, you can really spread that cost out, and that can kind of override our thinking. And so we want to make sure that we're benchmarking these in an appropriate way. And oftentimes that cost on a per acre basis is a really easy benchmark for us to think through.
Yeah, and I always like to say, you can penny per bushel yourself into a negative profit real fast on the expense side. So like we said, it can really be distort our thinking a bit if we don't really think through. So again, what we're trying to do is lay out here good things to watch out for. And this is a thing to watch out for, is it can really distort your thinking a little bit if you let it. If you don't let it, it's very useful. So I would say, David, the two most common measures of cost that we see are per acre costs and per bushel costs, and most things, probably still the most common measure is the per acre. And let's take a couple of examples and apply both of these concepts to them. So the first one would be, say, evaluating a cash rent, which cash rents this year is probably going to be a lot of evaluation going on with where they're likely to head. Per acre is the standard way to submit a cash rent bid, and so we're used to thinking about it that way. It's a known expense, so it makes sense to do it. When we look at per bushel, I think sometimes we can get some additional insights, though, because we can start to say, well, $350 is a really high cash rent, and I'm just not going to pay that. Well, sometimes it's useful to stop and look and say, well, what really is that going to be per bushel? What is the productivity of the field? And it's really important to think about that, because sometimes the highest cash rent field you have might be one of the lower you have on a per bushel basis. And so I think it's very useful to do those calculations and think about rents as well as a lot of other expenses that same way. Fertilizer is another one. Sometimes if I look at my operation, I see, some fields, they might have similar per acre costs, but when you look at per unit of output, you see very different results based on the quality of the land. So really useful, I think, to think about cash rent also on a per bushel basis. And same thing with livestock as well. The other thing I think that's useful, another decision is common, is marketing decisions. And here's a case where per acre is a lot harder to think about, because we don't typically sell an acre of crops, we're selling the bushels. And so somehow we have to convert those things back to dollars per acre, which I actually encourage you to do. Let's say it's $7, or next year bid for corn might be $6.50. Is that a good price or not? Well, we want to calculate it back to a per acre basis. It involves some calculations or mental gymnastics, as David said, but also it's helpful if we've got that per bushel cost in our mind. We get a very quick idea of saying, yeah, that price sounds pretty good, knowing where my costs are going to be for next year. So I think that kind of getting those cost numbers in your head makes the marketing decisions a little bit easier. And the other thing is that I think it's very useful as we go through the growing season. We can update those yield expectations pretty quickly. And I always say that, I've done this over the last few years, and one of the things I do is I'll make my forecasts at different points in time during the growing season and go back and compare with what I actually got. And one of the things I think is surprising is just how accurate we can actually be, especially about this time of year. You should have, most years you have a pretty good idea of where your production is gonna hit if you really push yourself to do it. Every year is different, but I update those costs as you go.
So Brent, to build off this, as producers think about using this, as they start to add that to their toolbox of things they can apply to their operation to try to get better insights and answer the questions with more confidence, want to help you think about some ways to make this more successful. And we have this slide titled Standard Year Measurements. And so the first thing we want to do is to spend a little bit of time before you start taking your total costs and dividing them by bushels. Think about, well, what's a typical process or for determining what output I should be using? Is it your crop insurance APH? Is it maybe an average birth rate? And you can think through a lot of different ways as to how you might go through this, right? You might have a farm average yield, you might have a field average yield. So you want to spend some time establishing that process, document it a little bit. So, leave yourself a few notes. So maybe next year there's some standardizations. And as Brent was mentioning about this sort of comparing cash rental rates across farms, we do some benchmarking. Standardizing that can really help us do a good job, make sure that we're being consistent. The second piece here is think about which output you want to measure against. You can quickly find there's sort of a rabbit hole here of, well, which number am I going to divide by? Is it on livestock? Is it per head? Is it per pound of gain? Is it per pen? Maybe it's per bushel or per gallon of irrigated water applied. You can see how, we can divide by a lot of different things here. So stop, spend a little bit of time and think about which measure is the most appropriate. And as we wrap this up, before we get to the lender part of this conversation, I think the really important thing here is sometimes we see this debate, maybe it plays out in academia more than in the common farm management circles, but it's, is total cost per acre or is it cost per bushel is better? And neither one of them is going to solve all of the answers. You probably need to use both, but rather than getting caught up in which is better, we need to stop and say, I need to know my total cost. That sometimes gets lost, is we need to put in good practices to know what the total cost is. And then we need to think about, what am I dividing that by to answer the question that's specific? The other piece here is, this is not a problem that's specific to agriculture. Think about the airline industry, right? They're flying airplanes. They have so many seats. They have so many passengers. They have so many miles flown. They have so many flights flown per day. And so they all have a very different type of output that they can measure against. And everybody in most folks in business kind of have this mismatch between the things that they're buying and the units that they're buying, but also the product that they're selling. And management's role oftentimes is to being able to jump back and forth and to slice that business case, that business financials, in a way to help them make better decisions. And that gets us to our third point: really define what you're trying to answer. Start with, what's the question that you want to pursue, and then what does the measure tell you? What are the trade-offs of this measurement on a per head basis versus a per acre basis versus a per bushel basis? If we're just using this tool for the sake of using the tool, it's probably going to cause a lot of confusion. But if we start with what the answer is, then we can build a process in our business, and that can really help us zero in on that measurement and how we can deploy it successfully.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important part, is knowing your costs are really important, and getting to some measures that help you make decisions, because that's what management is all about, is making better decisions, and we want to run the most effective business we can. So get some of these output measures, not just input measures like cost per acre, but start to think about them and how they can help you make better decisions. The other thing I would say, David, is we have several webinars in the archive of Two Economists and Lender about calculating costs and how to calculate those costs, which I think is an important component of this, getting the right costs in there, because it can really change your thinking when you start looking at different types of costs. So you might want to check that out as well. Make sure and put your questions in the Q&A bubble as we go. And David, I think you're up to bring in our lender.
And we always, questions about this topic specifically or costs more generally, we're happy to cover all of those. So at this point, we're ready to bring Tom in. Tom is our lender expert this month. It's been a lot of fun to work with Tom to prepare for this webinar. So he's going to answer a few questions with Brent and I. And then, of course, at the 30-minute mark, we'll wrap up the presentation and stick around for any questions in the overtime section. So Tom, thanks so much again for joining us. Let's kick this off by having you tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, David. Pleasure to be here. And as I mentioned, I'm Tom Hinkeldey in the Storm Lake office here at Farm Credit, and serve primarily the counties of Univista and Sac. And row crop producers, mainly corn and soybeans, and then a few livestock operations as well. Have 4 kids and live kind of west of the office here, and kind of help my family on the farm as well in the fall and spring sometimes. So.
Well, great. So, Tom, thinking about this lender and sort of that farm involvement that you have, curious to hear where you stand on the issue a little bit. What are your thoughts as we prepared for this?
Yeah, your guys' presentation was kind of spot on, and it's kind of dovetails with how I think about it too, which is I think there's insights to be gained from both ways of measuring things. I think on a per acre standpoint, the number of acres you're going to have in a normal year. That's how things are kind of sold to you, from crop insurance to seed chemical fertilizer to rent, and that's the common terminology. Whereas most farmers, I don't believe, set out to with the explicit goal of having the least amount of expense per acre. I think most producers, if my producer hat on, would like to raise the most efficient bushel that they can, the highest output for the minimum cost. And I think that measure kind of implies 2 things. 1, you're going to have to spend some money to raise those bushels. And 2, there's a point where raising more bushels and spending more money to raise those bushels isn't efficient anymore. It has a diminishing return. So I do think I like when people get in that cost per bushel analysis for turning that light switch on in their head, that with every decision I'm making on a per acre standpoint, there's got to be a return for it, on the output side of things. And so I think about that a little differently from variable cost to fixed cost too. So as Brent mentioned earlier, if every input that you purchased, was able to generate a marginal 10 bushels an acre over the competitor or not doing anything, we'd be raising, quite a bit of bushels out here. So again, that just brings up that concept that there's that diminishing return at some point in time, and you got to make those decisions. And I think with seed chemical fertilizer type of stuff, especially, you just really need to experiment on your farm to know which things are going to have the bang for the buck on the right soils and the right climate, and so on and so forth. On the fixed cost side of things, so what you pay to rent the farm or what you've invested to buy the farm, I think after you kind of know a history of the production capability of a farm, I think it's very important to look at the decisions on whether you re-rent the farm or whatnot based on the production capacity of that farm per bushel. And as you mentioned wisely, that high rent farm might not be the high cost farm.
So building off that rent example you shared earlier, as we were preparing for this, about an example when you were helping a producer sort of reorient the problem that they were facing with sort of a cash agreement versus a flex agreement. Can you talk about that and how you were able to sort of think about the productivity and how that impacted which rental option might be most preferred?
Yeah, so this particular customer kind of called in a little bit nervous one day. Their landlord was historically, or landlord's parent was historically a crop share type of landlord, and it had moved from a crop share 50-50 to a 50-50 with the tenant paying the chemical. And this landlord had passed away, and then it was on to their kids, and their kids called and said they'd be more comfortable with cash rent, and they were thinking about a particular number for cash rent. Well, and the customer I was working with was kind of concerned. This has always been a great lease, and these are great leases, and I'm just really concerned about the cash rent. Well, once we discussed what the cash rent was, and kind of looked at the APHs and their production history, kind of put pen to paper, if they had just been renting it the whole time, that crop share lease ended up being about $100 more expensive per acre than the cash rent that was being proposed. So it ended up being kind of a win for them. And if you're just kind of looking at a per acre standpoint of things, like, you could get lulled into thinking that switch to paying nothing for half the acres to paying rent on all the acres would be a rough one to stomach, but it actually ended up being a pretty good decision for that particular customer.
Yeah, that rent was probably a big sticker shock, thinking about, wow, that cash rent value, it's a really big number. How do I sort through that? we talked about earlier, Brent and I talked about earlier about how cost per bushel might be more familiar to think about from a break-even standpoint. Do you see a lot of producers using a break-even on a cost per bushel or maybe a cost per other output basis measure?
Yeah, I would say we talk a lot early in the season about, guarantees per acre, just with crop insurance and whatnot. But certainly as the season wears on, with a lot of clients, we'll have, cost per bushel broken out in three separate categories, sort of worst case, best case, and average case scenarios. And where I see them having the most problems with, getting things to a cost per bushel is sort of that last marginal acre that they're looking to rent, maybe this time of year even, where they say, I'm going to spend this much for variable costs and rent. And they kind of don't know what to do with the machinery side of things or the family living side of things. Do I allocate that stuff out too? This is that last acre, that 100 acres. I don't have to add anything new. I'm still living on the same amount of money. So that's where I run into, a lot of conversations with growers about, yes, I understand the thinking of just adding that last marginal farm, but it likely needs to have some of that expense allocated towards it to, justify its inclusion in the operation type of thing.
I have a couple more questions for you. One of them is, will producers ever have enough information to make a decision?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's always about getting enough information to be well informed and being able to live with the uncertainty at the end and making that uncertainty as small as it can be before you go ahead and make a decision. And you see that with a lot of farmers, probably most of the folks on here. Every year is a new experiment, and there's a lot of different new items to research in terms of what's new in the genetics world and with inputs. And I think the key is to experiment every single year on your farm, making different practices, researching as much as you can, but certainly not getting yourself into a analytical bind where you can't make a decision because you don't have quite all of it that you need. I think get as much as you possibly can, absorb as much as you possibly can, experiment, and then go out there and give it a shot.
Yeah, oftentimes I call that analysis paralysis, and I fall victim to that trap a lot. I sort of try to solve the answer, but sometimes you just can't account for all of that. So appreciate that perspective. One last question I have for you before we open this up to all the listeners today in the Q&A overtime. If there's one piece of advice that you could put on a billboard for thousands of producers to see here in September of 2022, what would that advice be?
Yeah, particularly with just agriculture and what I've noticed and what I've kind of tried to do as well is just to be a lifelong learner. Some of the farms I admire the most, they're always tinkering with stuff. Different planting practice, tillage practices, input practices, agronomy. They're taking in a lot of information from a lot of different trusted advisors. And integrating that into their operation and tinkering, experimenting, and trying to take in as much data as they can to make the next year a little bit better.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for this. We're at the 30-minute mark. We're going to kick it back to Carly as we get ready for the overtime Q&A.
Thanks. We have several questions in here. I see cash rents is a popular topic this month, and not surprising. Given higher land values, relatively strong farm incomes, and a push upward on rental rates. So we'll just jump into a few of those. The first one being, where do you see lease acres and rent rates going for next year? My feeling is that they will probably be higher. I'm fairly confident that that's going to be the trend. Now, that's always a risky statement to make because some rents are probably, may already be too high. So I'm not saying that all individual rental contracts are going up. I'm saying that when we look at kind of the trend and you look at university data and whatnot, you'll probably see a trend toward higher rates. Why is that? partly because commodity prices are very strong right now. So I think there is going to be pressure on rental rates to go up. The thing I always caution people against, and it reminds me back to the very first article David and I wrote when we started Ag Economic Insights, was about cash rental rates. It was the very first article we wrote, and we started off with a quote and said, the corn isn't high because a rent is paid. The rent is high because the corn is high. And the point of that quote is to say that rents aren't high because land values are high. Land values are high because rents are high. And that causation is really important to understand and think about. So in other words, it shouldn't just be, well, my land's worth more, so I should get a higher rent. Well, that's kind of the backward causality on it. And it's important to understand that rents have to go up in response to improved incomes, and that's what should drive it. And if other things are driving it, then it's a kind of a major warning. All that being said, I think they're probably going up. David, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
We follow a lot of data series, and so I know I'm going to make this broad statement about one data series that we follow, and there'll be a lot of anecdotal evidence or other data that doesn't quite track this. But one thing that we've observed is that cash rents are today about what they were 10 years ago. So they had a big run up to 2010, 11. So 11, 12, and 13, that's kind of when they plateaued. Then they slipped when farm incomes and commodity prices fell. And they've kind of gotten back to that same level on a per acre basis. Now, what's happened over those 10 years? Well, yields have gone up. At the national level, maybe, 15 more bushels of corn yield. So that cost per bushel has probably worked its way lower through most of our budgets. The other thing that's happened is farmland values are considerably higher than what they were a decade ago. So I do think there's going to be some upward pressure. Again, a lot of that's because of the profitability. And over time, we tend to raise bigger crops, and that helps lower that cost on a per bushel basis.
What are some of the methods you use to calculate cash rent, one that protects both parties to capture the rising value of farmland in Iowa, for instance? And so I think as we start thinking about cash rents, that's an interesting question to say, okay, how do we come up with a rent that we think is fair to both parties and reflects reality? And I think the best way to start with that is to put together some budgets. And so you can have a sense of, just what things look like. When we start to get a little closer, we'll get some ideas about what crop insurance guarantees and other things might be that helps come up with some numbers. So I think it's useful to have a kind of a transparent discussion with the two parties, saying, here's costs, here's what returns expect, here's what the productivity of the property is, what I think it can do. The other thing I think is important to remember too is it's just like every other business that you as farmers deal with. Think about your local elevator, for instance. How do they attract grain into their business? One of the ways is with the bid that they offer. So they might offer a really high bid and they get a lot of grain. But most of them, if you look across it, the bids are pretty similar. And so what they're trying to do is differentiate themselves on the basis of other factors in their offering. Maybe they offer better service, so they build a personal relationship with you, or they unload faster, or whatever it might be. And I think as farmers, oftentimes we need to start thinking a little bit along those lines of, okay, we could differentiate ourselves by paying the highest rent. That may not be the best way for success in your business. What about some other ways you can other things you can offer that customer that might attract them to lend or to rent their farm to you?
I'll just jump in there real quick, Brent, and keep in mind that fair is going to mean something very different to a lot of different people. As Tom shared in that example, that share rent has risk. There's yield risk. Maybe there's a cash flow consideration. And so we oftentimes need to think about all of the things that Brent mentioned. And so sort of the 30,000 foot level, then what works really well for maybe our specific operation. And the next consideration is what might be a need or preference or a desire for that landowner. And so you kind of have to triangulate between all of those factors. And there is not a one size that fits all, even if it's the highest bid, right? That still might not be the most attractive given everyone's differences for risk preferences and cash flow considerations and expectations about the future.
I was just going to say that, in my seat, have definitely seen the prevalence of flex leases tick up here as of late. A lot of different ways to structure those. There's some good examples on, I'll use Iowa State for an example. In my area, there's some good Iowa State examples of those, and a lot of data around what the long-term return to land has been for landlords on sites like that. So those are some references for folks too.
Here's another good question, kind of related. What do you do in your costs when you don't pay rent? For instance, you own the land. And probably all of us are in varying stages of that. Own some land, paying for some land, rent some land. How do you make a number that makes some sense for you to make decisions? And this isn't a favorite for an economist because we use this idea of opportunity costs, whereas someone like an accountant might say, well, you just use your book value that you purchase the land at. That's one approach. As an economist, we would say you probably ought to use something more like an opportunity cost, which is try and get a feel for what that land might be worth if you were to sell it. Even if you have no intention of selling it, you're trying to generate some kind of a return on it. And so I think you need to include some cost for that land, even if your only cost associated with it might be something like property taxes. It should probably be higher than that. May not have to take it all the way to what you might think it sell for at auction, but we want to make sure we get a number in there to account for it, because that will help us make more business savvy marketing decisions. So if we value that land really low, we might get ourselves lulled into a sense of we just don't have that much cost, so we can sell at different prices. Let's try and get what kind of return do we want to earn on that land in as our costs. David, do you have thoughts on that?
I encourage you to go back and watch the webinar from about a year ago. It was called what was that called? Know Your Cost of Production, which was kind of a similar idea that and Brent, we broke out the ideas in about a 30-minute conversation that Brent just outlined at a high level. It's like, there are maybe the costs that you need on a cash flow basis to really cover all that you need, all of your obligations. And then maybe there's this cost that's a little more economic or a little more of a goal that you want to get to make sure you're getting a proper return. So it's a great question, and you're going to want to think about that and create a process for your own operation.
Yeah, because it's like we said in that webinar, the PADVACE is know your cost, but what costs, and in that webinar we identify like 3 different categories of costs that we think are all important. And it mean different things at different times. For instance, you own that land, and you're making some large payments. So it might be even more than a cash rental payment. So we got to kind of think about through all of those costs. Here's a question for you, David. What's the formula you used to get to 554 versus 553 in the fungicide example? And I believe what David did is just took the total costs. He had a total cost at the top. He's figured 1,000 acres at $50 an acre, it'd be $50,000 add to that divided by the new yield. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So again, I want to say on that example in particular, we're not advocating for fungicide in any way. It was just a completely made up example, just a number to put in there. So keep that in mind. And as we said, that example is one. Frankly, a lot of things get sold on this idea of along those lines. And my point was, well, if we would have made that example to be 220 bushel corn versus 180 bushel corn, the cost would have looked even smaller. Whereas if you made it 100 bushel corn, so the point of all that is to say that's a case where those per bushel numbers can kind of get you into mentally and not the right kind of decision framework, and we want to at least understand that as we go forward, because as I said, the big question is what's the likelihood that we get that return. Okay, here's another question along the lines of the opportunity cost. If your equipment is paid for, what should you pencil in for that cost? Again, I think another example of we would want to use some kind of an opportunity cost. The other thing is that that equipment you're using, when you use it, has a depreciation cost. And I get it. If I take my combine out and run it for 10 hours, I could probably sell it for basically the same price that afternoon, barring a big breakdown, as I had it for that morning. But we have to admit that those hours of use accumulate and they do cost something. And so I think what you want to start to do is look and see what is that economic depreciation? What does it cost you to run that equipment? What's it going to cost you to replace that equipment at the end of the year, and start budgeting that in your cost? Because if you don't account for those costs and you don't sell at prices that are going to cover those costs, when you get your equipment becomes worn out, it's going to be really hard to replace it.
I was just going to say too, I think part of the thing that I've seen with farmers the last couple of years is that when they were making that calculation before, it used to be a pretty, I wouldn't say anything standard, but on some of the bigger ticket items, they had a history of how much they used a combine and what that trade was likely going to be based on the hours and whatnot. Well, the last couple of years, a lot of people were able to trade stuff in for, what they paid for it. So in my mind, what I keep telling people to do is, keep in mind what you paid for something and allocate it over out of a useful life to be conservative. And if you have to make an adjustment to your numbers on a one-off basis, once you trade it in and it didn't depreciate at all, that's better than the opposite. So I still kind of go with account for what a normal situation would be, and if there's a windfall when the trade-in happens, then so be it, type of thing.
Because what you don't want to do in this scenario, right, is to say, hey, my cost of production is here. I can afford to pay this cash rent to farm this additional 1,000 acres. And we haven't accounted for that machinery cost in a full value. So now all of a sudden we might have paid more than what we should have or would have had we accounted for that machinery. We're kind of robbing the machinery to pay the high cash rent, and that could get us in the story. I think the question is really good, and it's really one that we have to think about. There's no clear answers, but we want to avoid the scenario where we're under projecting what our costs are and we start making growth decisions using those lowballed, and as a reflection of maybe some good management decisions, right? Where maybe you're doing good things to get that payment worked down.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs there, and in the long run, we have to cover all those costs. And in the short term, sometimes we can make some sacrifices and maybe subsidize, returns one place or the other to kind of create, some return to overhead. But in the long run, we got to cover all of them. When we look at cash rents, man, some of those seem high. Do those ultra high cash rents cash flow on paper? And I think, again, that's back to that question of It depends, and it depends on the situation, and it depends what costs are, whether they make sense. And I think it depends on what's on your paper. And that at the end of the day, that's what's important to remember is what can you put on your paper. And sometimes it makes no sense. Sometimes it might make sense. And I think it really depends. But the key thing is to know what your costs are and what makes sense for you and your business as we go forward. What about fuel costs, and what about crop insurance? Should those be included in your crop insurance or in your cost of production budgets? And my answer is yes, they definitely should be. Crop insurance pretty obviously tied to the enterprise. Property and liability insurance is generally one of those overhead costs, and those are trickier to figure out how to allocate those and where to put them. And again, we have a webinar, we talk about how to do that. But yes, they're all costs that have to be paid and covered. And so what we want to do is try and figure out a way to allocate those out to the different enterprises, and we can play games with that and make one enterprise look really good and the other one really bad, but we don't want to do that. What we want to do is make good decisions and try and allocate them as we think makes most sense in our operations. So if, for instance, your irrigated production generates 80% of your revenue, one would think that you want to allocate more of the kind of general overhead costs to that enterprise, as long as it's generating those costs. So long answer to a short question, but yes, we need to allocate all those costs. Do we have others?
Nope, that looks like it. That's great. Thank you. With that, all those great questions. Appreciate you guys. That'll do it for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender. Thank you, Brent, David, and Tom, for leading today's conversation, and for you in the audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online again next month.